Hello, my name is Evan Perkins, and today I'm speaking with Audrey Goldstein about her current exhibition at Gallery KFS titled Shadowtime. Shadowtime is a house made of both the residue of time passing and the haunting of time lost. Made with discarded objects from an uninhabited home, Shadowtime is an embodied whisper, an attempt to contain our stories of loss and beauty within the ghostly walls of a home. This installation is made to highlight our felt experience, our physical selves beyond the screen. It's a building made to move through its rooms of time and begin to reset our pandemic isolation as you would reset a clock. Audrey Goldstein is an artist who lives and works in the Boston area. Goldstein received her BFA from the School of Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University and her MFA in sculpture from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. She's currently full-time professor and associate chair of art and design at Suffolk University. Audrey, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Evan.
I'm here in Gallery K Office looking at my installation Shadowtime. We're looking at the outside of the piece because the piece is a house, so we're kind of in the back hall of the house. We are walking toward the doorway that is the 11 p.m. to midnight doorway. So this house is made of separate panels that were made each hour of the day. We'll talk about those in a little bit. The entire house was based on this central sculpture, which I call the walking stick. So this piece was made with material that I somewhat rescued from my mother's house as it was being dismantled. She had been forced to leave, and it was up to me and siblings to take the house apart. She had been in the house for 60 years. It was a family home. It was the only home all of us knew, and kind of my New York operations base quite often. So these pieces, these objects some of them are absolutely incidental and irrelevant. Some of them actually have a history of their own. For example, that is my great-grandmother's sifter. This little box, the woven box, was where my dad kept his hand-carving wood tools, etc., etc. That was my grandfather's desk calendar. That was my son's little stuffed animal. So there's a lot of various, essentially objects that were saved from the trash heap. So each object is then encased in silk. I stitch it by hand into silk, and the silk is pigmented by me because you can't buy specific colors like this. Quite often it's pigmented in an uneven way, intentionally. And once it's encased in silk, I start the process of building the actual sculpture, which is to stitch these objects to each other. So there's nothing holding this up but thread. The thread is very structural. It's not decorative. Its intent is to form a bond that won't tear because I'm stitching into silk. I'm using a curved sewing needle so that I can, once I push it in on a flat plane, it'll pop up. And even this bramble was found. I cleaned it up for my outdoors in my mom's house. So This is made as a walking stick because I wanted to walk around defining the parameters of a house and kind of like create it in action. However, when I started doing tests of it outdoors, the documentation of it was it underwhelmed me, let's just say. It wasn't very interesting. So then I had to think about like, how do I document this as a creator of motion and time? So then I started, as the piece was sitting in the studio, I started looking at it, the kind of natural shadows that were cast. And that's when the idea for these pieces developed. So in addition to the panels that were made at each time of the day, there's also a silk shadow. The silk shadow not only contains the shadow of the sculpture, but it also contains a shadow of my mom. And here's a relationship that I think is pretty exciting for me between a shadow that's cast from light and a shadow that's cast from, that's a deliberate shadow that's cast from memory. So I'm very interested in that relationship. And we can go look at this a little bit more carefully, because you can see the stitch work and the moire pattern that happens in some places. This also has, just as a kind of technical note, I've run a very, very thin bead of acrylic edging so that this does not unravel. You can see a tiny little bit of it there. So, now I'd like to talk about the actual panels. So the panels were made through a series of tests. Eventually, I found that the best way to describe the shadow, to capture the shadow, was to suspend the sculpture horizontally from the ceiling of the studio and then work with the shadow as it was cast on each sheet of, this is Dorlor, so it's a translucent mylar vellum. So this is midnight, it was made at midnight, and in the middle of the night, one should be sleeping, and so my dreams tend to be very tangled, so I wanted to actually represent that with, this is really just, I think this particular area was made with kitchen twine and elastics. So in the shadow system, I lay down a coat of water. That's it, I just put water down with a brush, clean brush. And then this one is 1 a.m. And then I put down the objects. So the objects go into clean water. I make sure that there's contact on the object itself with the surface of the paper. And then I take a brush loaded with acrylic, liquid acrylic, fluid acrylic, depending on the brand, and just bleed it in. And then I walk away. And, or sometimes I just actually sit around watching the paint dry. But it takes its own time. That's an evaporation pattern right there. The really dark area are areas that probably took 2 days to dry, if not more. And sometimes these look very photographic. Sometimes the pigment separates, starts to break down. But it's real, I don't touch these. After I set up the situation, I just let the pigment dry the way it dries. And it's always a surprise to kind of come back in after it's dry. I mean, I check on it periodically, but to come back in and peel off the objects, because, you know, it's acrylic paint, so they'll stick a little bit, and see what happens. You never know. So these are just representing each hour of the day. This is 4 a.m. And this over here, the other doorway, is this is the back of 4 a.m. So switching over here, this is 7 a.m. So we're starting to get into objects that have to do with daytime. These objects over here were lima beans, because it's breakfast time and it was during the pandemic. This was a cut onion. This is 8 a.m. At some point there was a storm and a window broke, so I used the broken glass. And then we move back into nighttime. So now I'm going to walk us through to the morning room. This is the back of them. You can see a little bit of sheen, and that's because I used the Duralar is a finished surface, and that surface on one side, the other side is shiny, and that was intentional. So here we're moving into the morning room, starting with 5 a.m. Again, that kind of tangled residue of dream, and then dawn. Dawn really doesn't have very many objects in it because it's this kind of disassociated time period. 7 a.m. begins to have objects. The objects are not necessarily specific to the time of day, although sometimes they are. This is 8 a.m., so things are starting to get dense. This is 9 a.m. I mean, I guess from a certain point of view, you could talk about that being the commute that we used to do. These objects, the kind of flotsam and jetsam that are used in these images are things that also were cleared out of my mom's house. This is 10 a.m., so again, we're kind of in the density of the day. The color for each of these has to do with what I saw outside my studio window at that particular time of day. Not specifically in terms of object or image, but in terms of coloration and palette. The palette decisions were based on the shadow systems I saw, the way the light hit things, the color of the sky. And this took place, these pieces took place over the course of 2 years, so there could be 3 panels that are sunset, for example, which there are. Now we're walking around the back of the day room or the workspace. So I'm going to take us through the night room. into that space. These are smaller pieces we'll come back and look at. It's interesting to look at the backs of these because it's very clear that even though you can see the paint, you can't see surface in the same way. The surface is much more unified and not as specific as it is when you're looking. Directly at the paint on the surface. So the daytime goes counterclockwise just because the pandemic messes with time. So I'm going to start with 6 p.m. Very dense. I want to note this necklace over here because that's something we're going to look at. I brought the actual object into the gallery. Again, I never really know how the pigment is going to behave. It's very hard to predict whether the pigment is going to break apart and form its base mixtures, or if it will stay as a mixed pigment. So you can see here where the black just separated out in places. This is 5 p.m. There's some gloves in there. Four p.m. 3 p.m. 2. 1 and noon. The sculpture was hung in a way so that I was able to spin it, so to speak, so that it moved with each image. So that's why the shadow systems changed. So now we're walking through the back of the evening room, night room, and we'll look at the small pieces. So these are little sculptures made the same way. They are again from my mom's house, and I consider these portraits because they're somewhat head-sized. And I started playing with the idea of the silk shadow, and instead of just having the cast shadow of the object, this one has a silhouette of my mother's head. And this also has a painting that goes with it. The pigmentation on the painting is specific to the color of the silk. So rather than being generated about a clock or the time of day, this is generated through the object specifically. So the palette connects. This is another one that is my mom's friend. This is this is a portrait of a very close friend of my mother. And when I say portrait, I'm just being very more commemorative than documentation. And she used to come to tea at my mom's house. So, the shadow of my mom's friend, the silhouette, is right there. And so this one, just because I was playing with it a bit, this one, the silk, actually just cascades a little bit. And the painting for it, again, similar to the one before it, is the color is localized to the object itself. There was something interesting that happened, at least interesting to me, that when I was peeling the objects off of this painting, I actually missed one because it was so encased in pigment. So this one actually has a real object in it, right there. I don't know if it's legible, but the T-pin is still sitting on the surface, which it will live there. It'll just stay there. There's no need to pull it off. I think it's kind of interesting. And then these over here, I call the handhelds. These are little objects little sculptures that I played with as a idea of a kind of physical haiku, where I limited myself to 5 objects only. So these are 5 points of contact is the subtitle. These are intended to be held, made exactly the same way. And I used 3 little black stitched areas to always identify its base. So you can see the little black marks. Again, you can see that the stitching here is very much about holding and anchoring. So we'll just look at those. There's only one other one that I want to point out just because I think it's funny, which is that this one has Peter Rabbit in it, standing on his ears. So, and this is a door lock. So, and then I have, there's one other. The paintings that accompany the small objects are, some of them are, the more dense ones are several objects, shadow systems used. Again, it's local color, right? The color is identified from the silk on the object or the inherent object. It's the coloration of the object itself. So it's not about the passing of time specifically, rather than just demarcation of a moment, almost photographic in a way. These are very much printmaking. They're very much, the object creates its own image. And then I brought in a few little bags of the actual objects used. You can see the way that they get encrusted with paint. So they're just placed again on the paper. This is that necklace I had pointed out. So this was definitely, this has picked up some history. And these are 2 of the elastics that were used, or rubber bands, depending on where you're from. And so that's the entirety of the show. I do hope people are able to come and visit. It's up through mid-March, and just go to the Caiaphas Gallery website, and you can contact the gallery and let them know if and when you'll be able to visit. Thank you, everybody.